This morning at 9:47 a.m., federal prosecutors filed a RICO indictment, not against a mob family, not against a drug cartel, against what they're calling a criminal enterprise that operated from the highest levels of political power. I've prosecuted organized crime for 3 decades. I've taken down mafia bosses, corrupt union leaders, and international drug syndicates. But I've never seen RICO used like this. I'm going to walk you through exactly what this means, why prosecutors chose this nuclear option, and what happens when the most powerful anti-corruption law in America gets aimed at political power. This isn't speculation. This is evidence, and the evidence is devastating. Let me be clear about something before we dive in. RICO isn't just another criminal charge. It's the legal equivalent of a sledgehammer. When federal prosecutors invoke RICO, they're not just going after individual crimes. They're going after the entire organization. They're saying that what looks like separate incidents were actually part of a coordinated criminal conspiracy. They're saying the whole thing was rotten from top to bottom. In 30 years of federal prosecution, I've seen RICO destroy enterprises that seemed untouchable. Today we find out if political power can survive the same treatment. I'll be tracking every filing in this case. Every motion, every piece of evidence, no political spin. If you want to understand how the most serious charges in federal law actually work, subscribe now. Because what happens next will change everything you think you know about accountability in America. Here's what makes RICO so terrifying for defendants. Most criminal charges focus on single acts. You robbed a bank, you committed fraud, you lied to investigators. With RICO, prosecutors don't need to prove you committed every crime. They need to prove you participated in a pattern of criminal activity as part of an ongoing enterprise. The magic words are pattern of racketeering activity. That means at least 2 crimes within 10 years that are related to the enterprise. Once they establish that pattern, every member of the enterprise can be held responsible for every crime committed by the organization. The indictment filed this morning lists 47 separate criminal acts over 6 years. Money laundering, wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud the United States, witness intimidation, obstruction of justice. Under traditional prosecution, you'd have 47 separate cases with 47 chances for evidence to get thrown out or witnesses to change their testimony. Under RICO, it's one massive conspiracy case where all 47 acts become pieces of the same criminal puzzle. RICO turns individual crimes into collective responsibility. But here's the part that should terrify everyone named in this indictment. RICO comes with what we call the nuclear penalty. We're not talking about fines or even prison time. We're talking about forfeiture. When a RICO conviction comes down, the government can seize everything connected to the criminal enterprise, every asset, every property, every bank account, every business interest. I've seen RICO cases where defendants lost homes, cars, jewelry, investment accounts, everything they owned for decades. The theory is simple. If your wealth came from criminal activity, you don't get to keep it. The forfeiture provisions in this case are staggering. The government has already filed preliminary notices on properties worth hundreds of millions of dollars, real estate in multiple states, business interests, investment accounts, even trademark rights. If this RICO case succeeds, we're looking at one of the largest criminal forfeitures in American history. The defendants wouldn't just go to prison, they'd be financially destroyed. I know some of you are thinking this sounds extreme. How can the government take everything someone owns based on a pattern of crimes? Let me explain the legal theory, because it's actually elegant. RICO recognizes that criminal enterprises don't just commit individual crimes. They use crime as a business model. They generate wealth through systematic lawbreaking. When that happens, it becomes impossible to separate legitimate wealth from criminal proceeds. So the law says if you can't prove the money is clean, you lose it all. It's the ultimate deterrent against organized crime. The historical context here is crucial. RICO was passed in 1970 specifically to go after organizations that seem beyond the reach of traditional law enforcement. The mob, corrupt labor unions, drug cartels, white-collar criminal networks. Before RICO, prosecutors had to prove each crime separately. Crime bosses stayed insulated from day-to-day operations. They could claim they didn't know about specific crimes committed by their subordinates. RICO changed that forever. It said if you're running a criminal enterprise, you're responsible for everything the enterprise does. But here's what makes today's filing historically unprecedented. RICO has been used against political figures before, but never at this scale, never involving this level of power. The closest comparison is the prosecution of Governor Rod Blagojevich in Illinois, but that was primarily corruption charges with RICO added almost as an afterthought. This case puts RICO front and center. The government is saying that what looked like political activity was actually a criminal enterprise masquerading as legitimate governance. The evidence supporting this theory is extensive. The indictment details financial records showing systematic misuse of campaign funds, donor contributions diverted to personal use, fraudulent financial statements submitted to banks. But the most damning evidence involves what prosecutors call the pressure campaign. The witness intimidation charges are particularly serious. In my experience prosecuting organized crime, witness intimidation is often what turns a complex conspiracy case into a slam-dunk conviction. It shows consciousness of guilt. It demonstrates that the defendants knew their activities were criminal and were willing to commit additional crimes to cover them up. It also provides prosecutors with clear, simple charges that juries can easily understand. You don't need to understand complex financial fraud to know that threatening witnesses is wrong. But the government's strongest evidence may be the electronic communications, text messages, emails, recorded phone calls. The indictment references thousands of communications between enterprise members coordinating their activities. In RICO cases, electronic evidence is gold. It shows the ongoing nature of the conspiracy. It proves the defendants were working together rather than committing isolated crimes. It establishes the hierarchy within the criminal enterprise. One particular set of communications stands out. These are messages sent during the week after the election when it became clear that legal challenges weren't succeeding. The messages show enterprise leadership discussing alternative strategies for preventing the transfer of power. The indictment alleges these messages constitute evidence of conspiracy to defraud the United States. But under RICO, they're also evidence of the enterprise's willingness to commit any crime necessary to achieve its goals. Let me address the obvious defense strategy because I've seen it in every RICO case I've prosecuted. The defendants will argue that their actions were political, not criminal. They'll say they were exercising their First Amendment rights to challenge election results. They'll claim they were providing legal representation to a client who believed he'd been wronged. This is called the advice of counsel defense, and it rarely works in RICO cases. Here's why. RICO doesn't criminalize political activity or legal advocacy. It criminalizes using political power or legal processes to commit crimes. The indictment doesn't charge anyone with filing lawsuits or giving speeches. It charges them with filing lawsuits they knew were based on false evidence, giving speeches designed to incite violence, using legal processes to commit fraud. Intent matters in criminal law, and the evidence of intent here is overwhelming. The government also has what we call the continuing criminal enterprise. This is key to understanding why RICO applies. The indictment alleges that the defendants didn't just commit crimes around the election. They committed crimes before the election, during the election, and after the election. They defrauded banks to fund their activities. They defrauded donors about how their contributions would be used. They defrauded the government about the legitimacy of their legal challenges. This pattern of fraud spanning multiple years is exactly what RICO was designed to target. Now let's talk about cooperation, because that's where RICO cases usually crack open. In traditional prosecutions, defendants can stay loyal to each other because they're only facing charges for their own specific crimes. But RICO creates enormous pressure to flip, because everyone faces decades in prison for the collective crimes of the entire enterprise. I've seen hardened mobsters break when facing RICO charges. Political operatives are going to face the same choice: cooperate with the government or spend the rest of your life in federal prison. The cooperation agreements have already started. 3 individuals named in the indictment have signed plea deals in the last 2 weeks. They're providing evidence about the hierarchy of the enterprise, the decision-making process, the flow of money and instructions. In RICO cases, cooperation agreements often provide prosecutors with evidence they could never obtain through traditional investigation. The timeline for this case matters enormously. RICO prosecutions typically take years to resolve, but this case is on an accelerated schedule. The government has requested expedited proceedings due to what they call ongoing criminal activity. Here's what to watch for in the coming months. First, additional cooperators. Second, superseding indictments. As cooperators provide new information, expect additional charges. Third, civil RICO actions seeking monetary damages. The broader implications extend far beyond the specific defendants. Using RICO against political figures raises fundamental questions about law enforcement and democratic governance. But the government isn't criminalizing political activity. It's criminalizing the use of political power to commit traditional crimes, fraud, money laundering, witness intimidation, conspiracy. The evidence will speak for itself. Bank records don't lie. Electronic communications don't have political bias. The jury will be asked to determine whether the evidence proves systematic criminal activity by an organized group. This prosecution represents a test of American institutions. Can our legal system hold powerful political figures accountable for criminal behavior? Can RICO, designed to fight organized crime, adapt to address corruption at the highest levels of government? Can justice survive when politics and law enforcement intersect? The answer to those questions will determine whether we remain a nation governed by law or become a country where political power provides immunity from criminal accountability. I'll be covering every development in this case, every motion, every hearing, every piece of evidence. This is the most significant RICO prosecution in American history, and it deserves coverage based on facts, not politics. If you want to understand how this historic case develops, subscribe to follow the evidence wherever it leads, and let me know in the comments. Do you think RICO law should apply to political organizations, or does that cross a line that threatens democratic governance? I read every response because understanding how Americans view this unprecedented prosecution is crucial to understanding where our country goes from here.